Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and on this Dollars and Cents show, on these next two shows, I'm going to talk about the economic collapse in the context of prediction and prophecy. And as the framework for these two shows, I'm going to refer back to an event I spoke at in February, the Liberty Mastermind Symposium held in Las Vegas, sponsored by the Financial Survival Network, Carrie Lutz and Robert Ian. It was, all in all, a rather unexpected and extraordinary event. And for those of you who are curious enough to see what I at least mean, you can order the video of it from the Liberty Mastermind Symposium website, and I think it's $120. It takes place at one evening. They had a keynote speaker who spoke for an hour, and the body of the rest of the speakers, of which I was one of them, I think there were 14 in total, we spoke, each of us, for 20 minutes and participated on a couple of panels held the next day. But what happened in Las Vegas was rather extraordinary from my point of view and unexpected. But what I'm going to talk about today is, as I said before, the economic collapse in the context of prediction and prophecy. The title of the symposium was Countdown to Collapse. So that sort of put these talks in a certain context, that this was the only thing we had to go on, and we could speak on basically whatever subject we wanted, though we were given that as a context. And so it was. I was a speaker. I think I was one of the first ones on the afternoon of the second day. So we were midway through the main day of the conference when I spoke. And what happened was that one of the previous speakers in the morning was a guy named Turd Ferguson. And for those of you who are not aware of Turd Ferguson, he's got a following, and rightly so. He was one of the people involved in Tyler Durden's Zero Hedge website. And because of his thoughts and writings about gold, he's achieved a sufficient amount of following that he went out and formed his own website, and with their support, of course. And he didn't want to use his own name in something like this, so as a joke, I think it was, he came up with the word, his name is Turd Ferguson. Well, not only had he never expected to be this popular or this well-known, the fact that he had done so under the name Turd Ferguson, as he jokingly said at the conference, his mother even refers to him as Turd these days. Well, when he gave his talk in the morning on the 22nd in Las Vegas, he referred to a book that I knew quite well. It was called Gold Wars by Ferdinand Lipps. And Ferguson said that this formed sort of the basis of the way he saw the markets, the gold market. And in that book, Ferdinand Lipps, who had been owner of a Swiss private bank called Bank Lipps, all right, he had written his experience of gold. And Ferguson said this convinced him that the gold market was so important. This is why it was being manipulated. And if you saw the gold market within the context of the ongoing manipulation, it allowed you to make predictions that otherwise you could not predict. Because people who were used to, quote, free markets, supply and demand, et cetera, were of course going to make predictions that were at odds with what's happening in a market that was so heavily manipulated by central banks, the bullion banks, the cartels, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it made sense to me, all right, what he was saying, and I had read the book. So when it was my turn to speak, rather than launch right into my own talk, I referred to a little note that I had in the footnote of one of my books, Light in a Dark Place. All right, I'll show it to you here. This was a book that I wrote in 2006, okay? But there was an addition to this that I did in 2012 that is part of the second edition. And in it, when Turd was talking about bonked lips and the gold manipulation, I wanted to refer to a footnote that I had in my book regarding Ferdinand Lips. I have two friends of mine who knew Ferdinand Lips personally before he passed away, and they both referred to him as Ferdy, so they knew him quite well. And what people don't know about Ferdinand Lips is that he not only had a private bank in Switzerland in the latter part of his life, but in the 1970s he had been one of the founding directors of the Rothschilds Bank in Zurich, Rothschild AG. This is the family holding bank of the Rothschild family. Ferdinand Lips was one of the founding members of that bank. In fact, one of my friends told me that he knew Ferdinand Lips as Ferdy because Ferdinand Lips at the time was doing most of the gold buying for Europe. Almost all the gold flowed from Canada, being mined there, into Europe via Ferdinand Lips. Now, my research later showed me in one of the notes that he had been one of the founding members of the Rothschild Bank. Now, Lips passed away a few years ago. He was about to give a talk at the GATA conference in Yukon, and my other friend said that he had been, Lips had been involved in a car accident, not serious, not considered serious, and was in the hospital, and passed away quite suddenly and unexpectedly. And this friend of mine, who also knew Ferdinand Lips as Ferdy, remarked that it was quite unusual, hinting that conspiracies might have been at stake. And this friend of mine, I only want to assure you, is not that he doesn't believe in conspiracies, right? Generally. And yet he made that kind of a remark, which led me at the conference to say that he was a kind of a person who, and I used Brutus' name instead of Caesar, like who still didn't think that Caesar was, who still thought perhaps Caesar was stabbed by a lone assassin at the Forum in Rome, not by conspiracy. But nonetheless, Lips did die under those circumstances. And I want to read something from my book, from a footnote in my book, from another member of that board of directors of the Rothschilds Bank. This man is Dr. Alfred Hartman, and he was another fellow board member of Ferdinand Lips of the Rothschilds Bank in Zurich. Dr. Alfred Hartman, Swiss gnome extraordinary, I read from my book, was a former director of the Rothschilds banking group and former high-ranking executive at the notoriously corrupt bank BCCI. This footnote was drawn from a book called The Organized Criminal Activities of the Bank of Credit and Commerce, BCCI, and refers to Dr. Alfred Hartman as follows. Dr. Alfred Hartman, Director of Swiss Military Intelligence, former General Manager of the Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, and later Chairman of Hoffmann La Roche, that mega-national pharmaceutical company. Hartman resigned from La Roche following a price-fixing scandal involving the European Community. He was, as a main board director of the Rothschild family banking holding companies and general manager of Rothschild AG Zurich, he was forced to resign after payments by Rothschild AG Zurich, who he approved, to the alleged assassins of Roberto Calvi, who had formed the Banco Ambrosiano, which almost brought down the Vatican Bank. Calvi was known as God's banker and was found later hanged by the neck under the Blackfriars Bridge. And the payments from the payments to the assassins, alleged assassins, they were never convicted, being power as it is, were traced to the Rothschilds Bank, of which Hartman was the managing director, and he was forced to resign over this. Hartman was also a director of the Inter-Maritime Bank, which was owned by Bruce Rappaport, the Royal Bank of Scotland in Switzerland, and he was chairman of BCCI's audit committee, the most notoriously corrupt bank on the planet. And he was never investigated in that role by the SFO, the Serious Financial Fraud Office in Switzerland, or the FBI. And the reason why Hartman found his way into a footnote in my book, or was noted in my book, was that he was on the board of directors. He was a director of the Intermaritime Bank in Geneva, which was owned by Bruce Rappaport. And I noted at the talk in Las Vegas that I knew the name Bruce Rappaport. And I knew it because of a very interesting set of situations. Rappaport, I had met Howard Hughes's banker in prison in 1986. And his name was Dr. Norman Bernard Therian. And Norman was convinced he was innocent. And I took him at his word for it. And he was so convinced that he was innocent, he believed that he was going to get out on an appeal. And he had mentioned that he had previously been Howard Hughes's banker. And I didn't press him on the issue, but I was later to find out that before Howard Hughes, he had been one of the primary bankers for Daniel K. Ludwig. And when the Forbes 500 list first came out, Daniel K. Ludwig was the richest man in the world at the time. And before Ludwig, Norman had been the banker to Zuckerberg in New York, who was the major real estate holder of real estate in New York. So Norman's financial provenance was quite awesome in that world. And I never asked him what he was in there for, but I was to find out. Because when Norman's case was turned down, he asked me to come, and he knew I wrote. So he asked if he told me a story, would I write it down and get it out and put it in safekeeping, because he was about to do something, and he wanted to make sure that the information that he was going to tell was secreted away somewhere in case somebody who wanted to do him harm for what he was about to tell me would be less induced to do so. And what Norman showed me in 1987 was, first of all, a letterhead. It was a letter written, and I'm looking at it in prison, addressed to Lord Vincent Cranborne, Lord Viscount Cranborne, 2 Swan Walk, London, UK. And it introduced Norman as a former banker to Howard Hughes, who was representing a company called Transglobal Productions. And they were over there, and Norman was their financial representative to raise money for this group. Norman said that he had been approached by Perry Morgan, who was president of Transglobal, and another member of the board of directors, John Speller, Jonspller, to ask the Saudis for money for an Afghan resistance fund. Now, Norman thought at the time that a quote, movie production company being set up to ask the Saudis for money was quite curious. Now, Norman asked me to look at that letterhead and notice who was on the letterhead, because it was also CC'd not only to Norman, but to the chairman of Transglobal Productions, a man named General Robert E. Cushman. If you Google Robert E. Cushman, General Robert E. Cushman, you'll find out that not only was Cushman past commandant of the United States Marine Corps, he was a former deputy director of the CIA. Now, this letter that Norman showed me was CC'd both to him and to General Cushman. Norman said he had been caught. He had been done wrong by the perpetrators of this, because after he had raised $500 million from the Saudis for this, quote, Afghan fund, he had gotten into an argument with Cushman. Cushman had decided to let Norman in on a part of the deal that Transglobal was up to, and he told Norman that Transglobal was another board member of this notorious group, Rabbi Rosenthal. Rabbi Rosenthal was also a member of the ADL, and he was, I found out on the web, he was also a partner of John Speller, Jonspleller. Because if you Google Rosenthal and Speller, as I did, I found out years later that they were involved, they were at least accused of being involved in the assassination of Indira Gandhi in India, and providing the assassins with attractive land in South America, and that Rosenthal and Speller co-owned a company there in South America that they called Transglobal Resources. So this net was getting dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, that Norman told me. And of course, what was really curious about it is that I read that year confirming evidence, because in the LA Times that the Iran-Contra funds, which was also run out of the Reagan White House, have been traced to a secret CIA Swiss bank account commingled with $500 million of a Saudi U.S. fund intended for the Afghan freedom fighters. Exactly the amount of money and the exact parties that Norman had told me about. Norman told me he had run into a conflict with Cushman after Cushman told him that Transglobal was going to buy, via Rabbi Rosenthal and his contacts in the state of Israel, the arms that Israel had captured from the Syrian army in the Six-Day War, which were all brand new Russian armaments. They had kept them in a warehouse, and so what Transglobal was going to do was buy these arms for pennies on the dollar, I assume, from the Israelis who had no use for them. Certainly they never did, and sell them to the Afghan resistance at a much higher price and make a tidy profit in the middle. Norman said he exploded when he heard this. Why? Norman was a banker. He was all about money. But Norman had brought the Saudi royal family to the table. He was the one who knew the Saudi royal family, and Norman said that if the Saudis found out that Transglobal had used their money to buy these armaments from the Israelis and sold them to the Afghan resistance at a profit, they would go ballistics. So Cushman assures Norman that he wouldn't do so. 2 months later, Norman was kicked out of Transglobal, and within the year was arrested in Monaco on what Norman said were trumped up charges of accepting loan fees. So I read this, and I noted this when I began my talk in Las Vegas, and then I launched into my talk. And the talk dealt with my version of Countdown to Collapse. And what it began with was how I had predicted the collapse. As I said, the topic of this show and the following one are prediction, prophecy, etc., 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 especially in vis-a-vis to the ongoing economic collapse. And I hope to cover these subjects in a way that brings a little different light to bear on all of the subjects, the collapse, prediction, and prophecy in themselves. Well, I noted in my talk at Las Vegas that exactly to the week, 7 years before, I had given a talk in Salt Lake City before a group of which I was a member called the Positive Deviant Network. And in that talk, in that paper that I presented to them, it was a 148-page paper, I predicted that the United States and the world was going to go a Great Depression on the level, another depression on the level of the Great Depression of the 1930s, except this time even more severe because it would be accompanied by a cataclysmic currency implosion. Now, I had been studying this and focusing on the Great Depression since the 1990s. And so in 2007, when I gave that talk, I had a decade in, almost, probably at least a decade in, of focusing on this issue. The reason why my thoughts turned into a 148-page paper was that this group, the Positive Deviant Network, of which I was a member of, Martha and I were members, it was started by a friend of mine, close friend of mine, Marshall Thurber, who I'd met in law school before I dropped out and became a hippie. And Marshall had come to the conclusion that positive deviants, what he called positive deviants, were in a way what people could see as people who march to the beat of a different drummer and see solutions and the world in a way that other people don't. All right? Well, Marshall had also believed that in times of crises, positive deviants were the ones who held the answers. And positive deviants were mainly found not at the center, not in the mainstream of cultures and society. They were found at the edges. So what Marshall did was he gathered a group of what he believed were positive deviants and put them together, and this is how Martha and I happened to be there. Well, another one of those positive deviants was a person named John Body. And John at the time was 34, 35 years old, quite young. And his financial provenance, along with Bernard Norman Therian, was also quite striking. After graduating in the 1990s from college, John was immediately made a vice president of Kidder Peabody, became a senior vice president, and probably by 1999 or 2000 had been made a managing director of Deutsche Bank. All right, and he oversaw their trading operations of one of their units in New York and in London. And in 2001, with a group of his friends, he formed a proprietary multi-billion-dollar hedge fund via Credit Lyonnais, major French bank. All right, and in the next 3 or 4 years, his returns were extraordinary, growing well over 10% in all trading environments. And John was so successful, he was placed in the Bond Traders Hall of Fame by Credit Magazine. And because he was a member of the PDN, I knew that I just couldn't get up in front of this group and say that I think we're going to have an economic collapse and get away with it. So my opinions ultimately took the form of this 148-page paper, which I presented to the PDN. Well, what happened was that there was a lot of wealth in that group, and a lot of people were quite upset with what I was saying. But we had that very same weekend, we had a talk, a conversation with a man named Dr. Philip Tetlock, who had written a book called Expert Political Judgment. He was a professor. And what he had done over a 20-year study, he had sent questions to 284 people. Questions, they were in the media, experts, professors, known experts in geopolitical affairs. And he asked them questions such as, how do you think the Cold War is going to resolve itself? Do you think the United States is going to invade, blah, blah? Do you think Russia is going to do this? He asked them a series of questions. And these experts or people in the field filled this out and sent it back into him. And at the end of this 20-year study, he had all the results of these people. And he put it together and he published it in a book called Expert Political Judgment. And what Tetlock had found out was that these people, the experts in the field, their predictions over all these wide-body questions they had given them were no better than common chance. And in fact, he said the most well-known of the experts, the one in the media, scored worst of all. And, as I said at the conference, I said, well, the media experts are there not because they're experts, but because they mirror back to the readers, the readers' own prejudices and opinions. And the experts give these people, the people who read this and listen to them, the sense that they're right, which is really what they're looking for. People are really, they think they're looking for the truth, but they're really looking for affirmation that their worldview is the right. All right? So Dr. Tetlock spoke to our group of 60 people, 7 years before. And this was right after I had taken a lot of flack and criticism about painting such a dire picture of the collapse that was truly about to happen within the next 2 years. Within months of my presenting that paper, the $2 billion Bear Stearns hedge funds filled with subprime mortgages collapsed, and a year after that, the cataclysmic collapse of AIG and Bear Stearns happened on Wall Street, and with the rescue of it. But what was great, what was interesting about it is that Tetlock had come to the conclusion that the people who made the best predictions were the ones who had a combination of what he called hedgehog and fox mentality. In times, hedgehogs were the ones least likely to change their mind. Foxes were very quick. They move. They see what's happening, they're on it, they're on it. Hedgehogs were the slowest to finally change their minds. And each one had their own weakness. Hedgehogs tended to be wrong because they didn't see the change coming. And the foxes tended to be wrong because they tended to be too early and saw changes that weren't going to happen. But Tetlock had come to the conclusion that certain personalities had a combination of the hedgehog and the fox that allowed them to score higher than anybody else. And so on the Sunday, 7 years before, after I'd given my paper about the economic collapse, I saw my results on Tetlock's score, and I had 0 deviation. I had the highest score that you could get for making predictive abilities. And that's really the interest. That's how I started off my talk in Las Vegas. Because then I told them I was going to make predictions about not only where we are now, but where we're going to end up. And that is going to be the second show that I'm going to do. Predictions, prophecies, the collapse in 2013. Because the collapse that I predicted in 2007 has in fact happened. It hasn't resolved itself, but it hasn't. But it happened. And now in 2014, more is coming. In this show of Dollars and Cents, I'm going to finish up a subject that I began on the last show, where I was talking about a talk I had given at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium held in Las Vegas, February 21st and 22nd of this year. And it was called Countdown to Collapse. And I had given a background on a talk that I had presented 7 years before, where I had predicted a cataclysmic collapse was going to happen. And I also predicted other things that were at the end of the book that basically other people sort of dismissed, except a few people. And I'm going to talk about those today, because not only did the collapse happen, as I predicted it would, but it is in its latter stages, and the economic collapse is going to wipe away the world that we know, and we're familiar with it, and another world is going to come. And vis-a-vis this economic collapse, or this extraordinary change that's upon us, I want you to see it in terms of prediction and prophecy, because the line between the two, it exists, but is sort of smudged when you get down to it in certain people. Now, I had been studying the Great Depression for 10 years before I presented my 148-page paper at the Positive Reading Network in 2007. I was quite lucky that within months of my predicting such a thing in public, that it actually began to happen. Now, how I predicted that, I want to give you some background. The way I see it, how I came to know about these issues, started really in 1991. I was in my last years of a 10-year federal prison sentence. I was one of those hippie drug dealers that you read about. You don't read about them, not really. But I was in my last year of my sentence, and these words came to me. And I want to read them to you. They came, quote, out of the blue. I wasn't expecting them, but they were so significant, I wrote them down and I looked at them, and I was quite stunned by what they said. This is 1991 when I heard these words. In times of expansion, it is to the hare the prize goes. Quick, risk-taking, and bold, his qualities are exactly suited to the times. In periods of contraction, the tortoise is favored. Slow and conservative, quick only to retract his vulnerable head and neck, his is the wisest bet when the slow and sure is preferable to the quick and easy. Every so often, however, there comes a time when neither the hare nor the tortoise is the victor. This is when both the bear and the bull have been vanquished, when the pastures upon which the bull once grazed are long gone, and the bear's lair itself lies buried deep beneath the rubble of economic collapse. Every so often, however, there comes a time when neither the hare nor the tortoise is the victor. This is when both the bear and the bull have been vanquished, when the pastures upon which the bull once grazed are long gone, and the bear's lair itself lies buried deep beneath the rubble of economic collapse. This is the time of the vulture, for the vulture feeds neither upon the pastures of the bull nor the stored-up wealth of the bear. The vulture feeds instead upon the blind ignorance and denial of the ostrich. The time of the vulture is at hand. Those words came to me in 1991, and I wrote them down. At the time, there was no inkling that such a catastrophic event was going to happen. I didn't believe it, or I didn't disbelieve it. All I knew was those words had come to me, and I had written them down. Well, during the 1990s, I began studying the Great Depression. I turned to Martha and I said, why am I doing this? I had no idea, but nonetheless I did. And I think the difference between myself and most people who are looking at the Great Depression, I had no ideological axe to grind. Most people who come to the field of economics, like religion, have a point of view, and they're looking for evidence to support their point of view. And the evidence is ideological. According to economics, mainly, there's those on the left, the Keynesians, and then there are those on the right, the Friedmanites. And then there's that particular group that I found to have a particular affection for, was what is known as the Austrian School of Economics. And although many of the Austrian school like to identify with the right, they don't realize that they're coming from an entirely different place. That the left and the right, ideologically, are both promulgated by Milton Friedman on the right and John Maynard Keynes on the left, and both were firm believers in paper money. In fact, of all the ones between Friedman and Keynes who are going to have the greatest effect on modern economics in our times. It wasn't Keynes, as those in the bloggers like to scream at and blame him for what was happening. It was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman had the most influence on Richard Nixon and his economic advisors when Nixon decided to shut the gold window in 1971. Friedman told him that by shutting the gold window, cutting the link between gold and fiat pay and money, that the free market would take care of the disparity in the printing of paper money. That if you printed far more money than you should have, your money would become worthless and go down in value. And in fact, the very opposite happened. The United States printed more money than any other country on the face of the earth. It had the largest negative trade balance soon after we went off the gold standard. And the opposite, in fact, had happened. The U.S. dollar just gained strength, gained strength, and gained strength. Neither the left nor the right was right about what was going to happen. My questions were rather pure. What caused the Great Depression? Why did it bring commerce to a virtual halt in the 1930s? And that's really what it was. And I had done some extensive reading and study on it, so by the time that the dot-com bubble burst in the year 2000, I already had a preformed opinion of what was going to happen next, and it truly did. By the time that Marshall convened the Positive Deviant Network in 2005, my opinions were pretty much solid. All right, and I had no audience. I mean, I had no voice. Marshall, my friend, was one of the few people I told about this, and I don't think he liked it because Marshall's an Aries and he has a very positive point of view. And what I was painting was a picture so bleak that the positivity of it was sort of escaped most people's grasp at the time. I, however, do have a very positive view of what's going to happen, but it's going to happen after the collapse. Most of the people out there, both on the left and the right, are merely trying to salvage the current economic paradigm. What I said at the conference in Las Vegas was I was going to predict what was going to happen. Just like I had predicted the collapse in 2007, I am now going to predict the world that is going to be here after the collapse, and I'm going to tell you why. In Las Vegas, I went over the work of 3 people that I wanted to bring to the fore. And the first one clearly falls in the world of prediction, not prophecy. It's an academic work by David Hackett Fisher. All right? He's a professor, and he had written a book called The Great Wave. And Professor Fisher had gone back through history and had shown that periods of stability, and he gave them names, like the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Victorian Stability. These were periods of relative stability and prosperity. But Professor Fisher had pointed out that each one of these periods had been interrupted by what he called great waves. Another term Professor Fisher used for these were price revolutions. And what he said was this: after these periods of stability and prosperity, epochs, what would arise would what he called was a great wave. A great wave that at the end would have destroyed the present epoch and period, brought it to its knees. That what had started out as stability and prosperity would end up in economic calamity, institutional collapse, and a complete rendering of the previous epoch. And out of that rendering and collapse of the previous era, a new era would form. An era quite different than the preceding era, and an era of a higher quality and standard of living necessarily, or just different than the previous era. In other words, Fisher saw these as improvements. It was like how a snake sheds its skin, that the period of shedding it is cataclysmic, not pleasant perhaps to the snake. I don't think the snakes care, unlike us, who do get attached to stability and prosperity. But these periods, these great waves, Fisher pointed out, happen intermittently, bringing the previous period to an economic standstill. All right? And these periods last between 80 and 160 years. These periods are often accompanied not only by economic uncertainty, but by calamities on a magnitude that we can't imagine. All right? The great wave between the period known as the Middle Ages, or the Feudal Ages, and the Renaissance was accompanied not only by economic uncertainty, collapse, and chaos, but by the Black Plague. The period between the Age of Enlightenment and the age of what he calls the Age of Victorian Stability, Fisher calls, was accompanied by the 100 Years' War. Total devastation. All right? Well, Fisher said that we are in another great wave whose amplitude of change is greater than any wave he has studied previously. So we are in the mother of great waves that is about to crest. And I want to read to you what Professor Fisher said is common to all such great waves. In each great wave, between each period, food and fuel led the upward movement. Manufactured goods and services lagged behind. These are prices. So food and fuel started going higher and higher and higher. Manufactured goods and services went higher too, but not at the rate of change of inflation that food and fuel did. These patterns indicated, according to Professor Fisher, that the prime mover was excess aggregate demand, generated by an acceleration of population growth or by rising living standards, or both. Eventually, in each great wave, prices went higher and higher and became increasingly unstable. They began to surge and decline in movements of increasing volatility. Severe price shocks were felt in commodity movements. The money supply was alternately expanded and contracted. Financial markets became unstable. Government spending grew faster than revenue, and public debt increased at a rapid rate. In every price revolution, the strongest nation states suffered severely from fiscal stresses. Spain in the 16th century, France in the 18th century, and the United States in the 20th century, in the present price revolution. Wages which at first kept up with prices now lag behind as the wave crest. Returns to labor declined while returns to land and capital increased. The rich grew richer. Inequalities of wealth and income increased. So did homelessness, hunger, crime, violence, drink, drugs, and family disruption. Great waves last between 80 and 160 years. The present great wave began in 1896 and is now cresting. Professor Fisher wrote in his book, that the amplitude of change in this current great wave is greater than in any previous wave, which could lead to my belief, I think it qualifies it, that what is going to happen to this is we're going to see change on a magnitude and on a level that we haven't seen before. Governments, institutions, religions, and cultures are going to be flattened when this great wave finally crests, as it always has, bringing the previous epoch to a complete end in almost complete devastation, out of which another era will arise. This fully falls in what I call into the area of prediction. This book, that The Great Wave, was written in 1996 and published by Oxford University Press. It is an academic work. I referenced it when I gave a talk in Munich. I was invited to speak there a couple of years ago by Professor Antal Fekete, a deep friend of Martha and mine. And I used this book, Fisher's book, and a book written by a friend of mine called Fiat Money, The History of Currency, written by a very, very good friend of ours, Ralph Foster. And at the talk in Munich, there was a sort of a hot dog of a student there. He's young, Austrian economist. He had gone both to the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama and was a student at the London School of Economics in London. And he sat there with his computer taking notes on what I was speaking about and trying to reference my material to criticize my talk. I didn't mind this. If I was wrong, I wanted to know it. If it was just a point of view, I could handle that. I mean, after all, points of view are just points of view. This young man couldn't find any criticism of my point of view. And in fact, when he tried to turn down the interviews, my sources, he found very little on the history of fiat money by Ralph Foster. And that's because the powers that be don't want you to know the history of fiat money. Its absence is there for a reason. And this is what I said in Las Vegas. And I said this in Munich too. That the information that you find on the internet and in your libraries is quite controlled by the powers that be. The internet is much harder to control, so what you're able to find on the internet doesn't always fit with the mind manipulation going on in the powers that be, who have a vested interest in the way things are. But nonetheless, David Hackett Fischer made these extraordinary predictions that we're in the middle of an extraordinary rendering of the present epoch in his book, The Great Wave, Price Revolutions in History. The next person I referenced in Las Vegas was Bucky Fuller. And my friend Marshall Thurber, who had put together the Positive Deviant Network, was a very, very close friend of Bucky in the latter part of his life. Marshall recognized Bucky for who he was, an extraordinary mind and heart, a rare combination in this world. People of heart don't always have the at least reputation in the field of intellect that their peers do. And in fact, if you do have a great heart, your reputation is invariably tarnished by those in the field of especially economics who look with suspicion upon those who bring feeling and heart into the world of economics, what they consider hard science. It's not hard science. It's heartless science. It is a world of numbers without feeling, without compassion. And this is what basically part of the archetype that's falling apart and is in the process of being destroyed right now. That the scientists and the academicians in our schools, medicine, philosophy, economics, sociology, history, have studied their field and risen in the belief that their study without heart is a pure study. It's not. It's merely a more heartless study. And we're going to find out, and we're in the process of finding out, that the conclusions that these, quote, scientists have sought, blinding themselves in what they believe is a search for truth, they have only found their own truths, which are limited. Bucky Fuller was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he predicted in 1981 in his book, The Critical Path, he said, mankind is entering upon a crisis, an unprecedented crisis. This is from The Critical Path. It is moving, humanity is moving ever deeper into crisis, a crisis without precedent. First, it is a crisis brought about by cosmic evolution, intent upon completely transforming humanity from a complex of competing, differently colored, differently credoed groups into an integrated, comprehensively inconsiderate, harmonious whole. This crisis is going to bring us together and result in a world of unprecedented prosperity. The foreword to what he had written in The Critical Path was called Twilight of the World's Power Structures. 10 years after Bucky wrote this book, the first world power structure collapsed, communism. 30 years after he penned these words, the primary power structure, capitalism, is also collapsing. And Bucky said out of the collapse of these two power structures was going to arise a world far beyond our ability to even conceive of at this time. Bucky said that this great change is going to be triggered by the economic bankruptcy of the United States, the most powerful of the current sovereign states. And the bankruptcy of the United States, which looks like it's self-induced, And we have criticism of both on the left and the right pointing fingers at each other, saying that each side is responsible for the collapse of the whole. Bucky said, no, it's not true. That this economic collapse of the sovereign state of the United States, and of all sovereign states ultimately, not just the United States, which is going to result in a far better world, is what Bucky called a Class 1 event. Bucky separated events that cause changes on the planet Earth into Class 1 and Class 2. Bucky said Class 2 events were set in motion by man. All right. By man's attempts either for self-promotion, self-aggrandizement, or, quote, even to make things better for the collective humanity that were set in motion by man. He said these are Class 2 events. The collapse that we are involved in right now, the economic collapse of the magnitude that David Hackett Fisher pointed out in his book, The Great Wave, Bucky said was a Class 1 event. An event set in motion by the universe itself. Bucky used the word universe in the place of the word God because the word God is so loaded by the folks who have the power on this planet. They've distorted the purpose of the universe, applied it to their own situation, and said they are the beneficiaries of the universe, even though they don't believe in God, really beyond a lip service that they have. But generally, that the universe is moving at this time to bring the current power structures to its knees and to bring a higher level of living, of connectedness to each other that doesn't exist at this present time. Now, Bucky arrived at these conclusions because of something he had gone through. He had a spiritual experience, which basically brought him to his ability to prophesy. But in Las Vegas, I ended up with the prophecies of a person named Edgar Cayce. And I suggest for those of you who are listening to this to Wikipedia Edgar Cayce. Because he said that we are moving into a period of ultimate collapse. I want to show you what it looks like right now. He said this period is going to be collapsed by earth changes, a series of catastrophic earth changes that are going to bring our planet to its knees. That graph started in 1900. When it started moving up was in 1945, when Cayce died. When it really started moving up was in 1965, and you see where it is now in the year 2009, 2010. These are the things that Edgar Cayce said was going to happen. It was not prediction. It was prophecy. Edgar Cayce was a psychic. He said these periods of earth changes were going to cleanse humanity and usher in a period of brotherly and sisterly love. This is what I spoke about in Las Vegas. And I told them that it's not going to be easy, but as I've always ended each one of my articles that I started writing in 2007 with the words, buy gold, buy silver, have faith. And of these three, faith is the hardest to come by. But in times of great change, it is what you're going to need most of all. Better times are coming. That transition is not going to be easy. But that doesn't mean it won't come. We're about to get our clock clean. A pendulum is in motion. And whether you experience that pendulum as a wrecking ball or as a pendulum is up to you. Hanging on to the old world is going to come at your own peril. Letting go will allow you to watch the changes and survive what is about to happen to us. We are at the edge of the greatest change that humanity has ever seen. The person who followed me, Greg Manarino, echoed these thoughts. And I was surprised that Greg had said it because they echoed my own beliefs, that mankind has not seen the changes that are about to happen. And usually we face the future of change with fear. My counsel to you is, don't fear. Watch it, accept it. The universe is moving. If you want to use that word, God, then do so.